There is a clay tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology that does something no other ancient document does in quite the same way. It does not tell the story of one city falling. It names them, one after another: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, Ur, Nippur, Uruk. It catalogues over 40 cities and sanctuaries, each one abandoned by its patron deity, each one struck by the same destructive agent. The composition is known as the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, and it survives on multiple cuneiform tablets held across 3 continents. Some fragments sit in Philadelphia. Others are in the British Museum in London. Others remain in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The text was first translated into English in the mid-20th century by Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the most respected Sumerologists in the history of the field, a scholar who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania decoding these exact tablets. What Kramer translated was not a myth, it was a list, and the destructive agent it names is not a god, not a demon, not a flood. It is a wind, a specific wind, moving in a specific direction, killing everything in a specific sequence. That sequence has never been explained. The Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur is not a short poem. It runs to nearly 500 lines in its most complete reconstructions. The language is Sumerian, written in cuneiform script, and the tablets on which it survives date as physical objects to approximately 2000 BCE. The composition mourns the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, conventionally dated to approximately 2004 BCE, but the scope of what it describes extends far beyond a single dynasty. It describes the systematic end of an entire civilization. City by city, sanctuary by sanctuary, the text names every major urban center of Sumer and records the moment its god left and its walls fell. The pattern is not random. The cities are named in what appears to be a geographic sequence, moving from the south and east toward the northwest, following the path of what the text calls the evil wind. The text specifies that the wind came from the west and south. It specifies that the wind was not a normal storm. It uses terminology that distinguishes this event from the seasonal dust storms that the Mesopotamian scribes knew well and had separate vocabulary for. The wind did not bring sand. It did not bring rain. It brought something that killed people who breathed it, killed animals that stood in it, and poisoned water that it passed over. The text describes bodies piling in the streets, not from violence, not from famine, but from exposure to the wind itself. This is the detail that Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial linguist and author of the Earth Chronicles series, seized upon in 1985 when he published The Wars of Gods and Men. Sitchin did not read the Lamentation as a theological poem about divine abandonment. He read it as a damage report. His claim was specific. The evil wind was not a metaphor, it was fallout, and its point of origin was not Sumer, it was the region the Hebrew Bible calls the cities of the plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. The tablet does not list cities that were erased before Sodom. It lists cities that were erased because of Sodom. And the order in which they appear follows the path the wind would have travelled if it originated at the southern basin of the Dead Sea and drifted northeast into the Mesopotamian lowlands. If you find that the conventional explanations for texts like this have not fully accounted for what they contain, if you suspect that details buried in museum collections have been catalogued but never seriously examined, this channel exists for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been carrying. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur is well established and well supported. Piotr Michałowski, a professor of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan, published the critical scholarly edition of the text in 1989. His analysis places the Lamentation firmly within a recognized Sumerian literary genre known as the city lament. These laments were composed in the wake of political and military upheaval, and they follow a recognizable pattern. The patron deity of a city announces that the divine council has decreed the city's destruction. The god or goddess weeps, the city falls, the wind comes, the people die or scatter. The purpose, in Michalowski's reading, is theological. The lament explains suffering, by placing it within a framework of divine decision. The gods chose to end the current order. The wind is the instrument of that decision. Thorkild Jacobson, who held positions at both the University of Chicago and Harvard, and who translated the related Lament for read the evil wind similarly. In his 1987 collection, The Harps That Once, Jacobson presented the wind as a literary device, a way for the poet to unify disparate local destructions into a single theological narrative. The historical reality behind the poems, in Jacobson's view, was the Elamite and Amorite invasions that ended the third dynasty of Ur. The wind was poetic shorthand for military devastation. The historical framework supporting this reading is substantial. The third dynasty of Ur did fall to a combination of external pressures. The Elamites, based in what is now southwestern Iran, attacked from the east. Amorite groups pressed from the western desert margins. The last king of the dynasty, Ibbi-Sin, watched his empire contract year by year as provincial governors stopped sending tribute and outlying cities declared independence. The final blow came when the Elamites sacked Ur itself, captured Ibbi-Sin, and carried him off to Elam, where he died in captivity. This is documented not only in the lament literature, but in administrative correspondence and year-name formulas from the period. It is real history, and the conventional reading of the laments as literary responses to this real military catastrophe is internally coherent. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose translations opened these texts to English readers beginning in the 1940s, agreed in broad strokes. The laments were literature, not reportage. They served a ritual function, performed in temples during periods of rebuilding and restoration. The cities named in the text were real, the destruction was real, but the literary framework imposed a structure on chaotic events. The sequence of cities, in this reading, reflected the poet's compositional choices rather than a physical trajectory. This interpretation has been the consensus position in Assyriology for over half a century. It is supported by strong arguments. The city lament genre is well attested. The theological framework is internally consistent, and no mainstream scholar has found reason to treat the geographic sequence of city names as anything other than literary convention. That is the standard reading. And it accounts for nearly everything in the text, nearly. What the conventional reading does not explain is the direction. In 1985, Zecharia Sitchin published The Wars of Gods and Men, the third volume of his Earth Chronicles series. Sitchin was not an Assyriologist by training, and this point has been raised against him more times than any specific textual objection. But what he did in that book was something no Assyriologist had done. He took a map. He took the names of the cities listed in the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, and he plotted them in the order the text presents them. The result was not random, it was a line, a geographic line moving from the southeast to the northwest, across the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, consistent with prevailing wind patterns originating from the region of the Dead Sea. Sitchin's argument was built in layers. The first layer was textual. The Lamentation does not simply name cities, it names them in an order, and that order corresponds to geography. Eridu, the southernmost of the ancient Sumerian cities, appears early in the destruction sequence. Nippur, further north and inland, appears later. Ur, positioned in the south but west of Eridu's position relative to the incoming wind, appears in a placement consistent with a southwesterly airflow. Sitchin argued that a poet composing a theological lament would have no reason to organize the cities by wind trajectory. A poet would organize by importance, by theological rank, or by narrative drama. The geographic ordering, Sitchin claimed, was not literary. It was physical evidence embedded in a literary text. The second layer was the identification of the wind itself. The Sumerian term used in the Lamentation and in the related lament for is consistent across multiple tablets. The evil wind, not a storm, not a seasonal gale, a wind that kills on contact, a wind that the texts say caused people to pile up in heaps in the streets, a wind that did not bring rain, did not bring sand, did not bring visible debris. It brought death, and the symptoms described in the texts are specific. People could not breathe, animals collapsed, water became undrinkable, The land itself became barren for a prolonged period after the wind passed. These symptoms, as it happens, are not unique to the Sumerian texts. The Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic of the Indian subcontinent, describes divine weapons whose aftermath includes the same list: hair falling out, water turning poison, land going sterile. Two traditions, two continents, the same symptoms. That parallel will be examined in detail later. For now, the Sumerian evidence. Sitchin was not the first to notice that these descriptions do not match any known meteorological event in the region, but he was the first to propose a specific origin point. His reading of other Mesopotamian texts, particularly passages from the Era epic, led him to argue that two members of the Anunnaki Council, the deities Nergal and Ninurta, had deployed what the Era text calls the 7 awesome weapons against targets in the Sinai Peninsula and in the region the Hebrew Bible identifies as the cities of the plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. The weapons destroyed those targets directly. The 7 weapons, as described in the texts Sitchin analyzed, are given individual names and described with characteristics that include blinding radiance, the ability to level structures at a distance, and the production of an aftermath that lingers in the environment long after the initial detonation. Sitchin translated these descriptions as consistent with nuclear devices. His critics respond that the language is consistent with conventional descriptions of divine power found throughout Mesopotamian literature, where gods routinely produce radiance, destroy structures, and alter landscapes. The textual evidence alone cannot resolve this dispute. Both readings are linguistically possible. What the textual evidence can do is establish the geographic relationship between the detonation site and the downstream effects. The wind was the aftermath, and it travelled, as winds in that region do travel, from the southwest to the northeast, across the Jordan Valley, across the Arabian desert fringe, and into the river plains of Sumer. This is a specific, testable geographic claim. It does not depend on whether one accepts Sitchin's broader framework about extraterrestrial beings. It depends only on 3 things. First, that the cities in the Lamentation are listed in a geographically sequential order. Second, that a catastrophic event at the southern Dead Sea Basin would produce atmospheric effects that drift northeast into Mesopotamia. Third, that the symptoms described in the Sumerian texts are consistent with exposure to the aftermath of a high-energy detonation rather than a conventional military invasion or a natural storm. Each of these 3 points can be evaluated independently. The first is a straightforward exercise in mapping that any graduate student with access to the text and a geographic database could complete in an afternoon. The second is a question of atmospheric science, and the prevailing wind data for the eastern Mediterranean and Arabian desert regions has been published by National Meteorological Services and is freely available. The third requires comparing the symptom descriptions in the Sumerian texts against the known effects of different categories of atmospheric contamination, from volcanic ash to chemical agents to radioactive fallout. None of these evaluations requires accepting Sitchin's broader framework. None requires believing in the Anunnaki. None requires any commitment beyond the willingness to take the text seriously as a potential source of physical data. Sitchin was not a meteorologist. He was not a geologist. He was a man who read Sumerian texts and noticed a pattern that the credentialed specialists had not addressed. The question is not whether Sitchin was qualified to draw the conclusion. The question is whether the pattern he identified is real, and that question, as of this recording, has not been answered by anyone with the credentials to answer it definitively. There is one more detail in the lament literature that bears mentioning in this context. The lament for includes a passage in which the god Enki, the patron of Eridu, and the god most consistently associated in Sumerian literature with the protection of humanity, attempts to warn the population of the approaching wind. The text describes Enki directing the people of his city to flee, to abandon their homes and possessions and move upwind, away from the approaching threat. In the Atrahasis epic, it is Enki who warns the flood hero to build a boat. In the lament for it is Enki who tries to save his people from the wind. The parallel is structural. Both times, a catastrophe is coming. Both times, One member of the Divine Council breaks ranks to warn the human population, and both times the warning comes too late for most. The Era epic, held in the British Museum and the Iraq Museum, adds a critical detail. The poem describes Era, a god of destruction, being granted permission by the Divine Assembly to unleash devastation. The text names specific targets. It describes the aftermath in terms that overlap with the Lamentation's description of the evil wind, and it provides what Sitchin read as the motive. The cities of the plain were not destroyed as punishment for human sin, as Genesis 19 frames it. They were destroyed as collateral in a conflict between divine factions, a war among the Anunnaki themselves over territorial control and the future of the human settlements they had established. If the geographic sequence in the Lamentation is not literary convention but physical record, the implications restructure the entire conventional timeline of the late 3rd millennium BCE in the ancient Near East. The fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, dated to approximately 2004 BCE, is one of the most studied collapse events in Mesopotamian history. Conventional scholarship attributes it to a combination of Elamite military incursions from the east, Amorite pressure from the west, and internal administrative failures. These explanations are well documented and well argued, but they have always carried a gap: the speed. The 3rd dynasty of Ur did not decline gradually, it collapsed within a generation. Ur-Nammu founded the dynasty around 2112 BCE. His successors built one of the most sophisticated administrative states the ancient world had seen, with standardized weights, centralized record-keeping, and a legal code that predates Hammurabi's by roughly 3 centuries. And then, within decades of its peak, the entire system disintegrated. The Elamite invasion is the conventional trigger, but Jacobson himself noted that the destruction described in the lament literature exceeds what a military campaign would produce. The texts describe not just conquest but abandonment. The gods left, the people died in the streets, the water turned foul, the land went barren. The administrative tablets from the final years of Ur-3 tell their own story. The archive of Drehem, a redistribution center near Nippur, shows normal bureaucratic operations continuing almost to the end. Livestock deliveries, temple offerings, personnel records, all functioning within established norms. And then the records stop, not gradually, not with a tailing off of entries over years or decades. They stop. The scribes, who had maintained one of the most detailed administrative systems in the ancient world, simply ceased writing. This is the pattern of a sudden catastrophic event, not a slow military attrition. Other sites show the same abrupt termination. Girsu, Umma, Puzrish Dagan. The administrative records end within what appears to be a narrow window. Military conquest typically produces a transfer of administrative control, captured cities continuing to function under new management. What the Ur-3 archives show is not transfer but termination. The apparatus of civilization did not change hands, it ceased to exist. If the evil wind was real, and if its origin was a catastrophic detonation event at the Dead Sea Basin, the speed of the collapse becomes explicable. The conventional response to this argument has been dismissal rather than refutation. No peer-reviewed paper has addressed the geographic sequencing of city destructions in the Lamentation. No published countermodel explains the directional wind pattern as a literary artifact rather than a physical one. The academic silence on this specific point will be examined in detail. But the silence itself is part of the evidence. You do not need decades of military attrition to destroy a civilization if a single atmospheric event renders its agricultural heartland uninhabitable. The alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is flat. It is low-lying. It has no mountain barriers to the southwest. A toxic atmospheric plume originating at the Dead Sea, roughly 700 kilometers to the southwest, would reach the southern Mesopotamian plain within days depending on wind speed, and it would settle precisely where the most densely populated, most agriculturally productive cities were concentrated. This is where the Genesis parallel becomes structurally significant. Genesis 14 names 5 cities of the plain and their kings: Bera, king of Sodom; Bersha, king of Gomorrah; Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which the text identifies as Zoar. These are not vague mythological references. They are named rulers of named polities in a named geographic region, the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. The traditional location of these cities is the southern Jordan Valley, along the eastern and southern shores of the Dead Sea, in what is now the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The region is known as the Middle Gore, and it is one of the most geologically distinctive landscapes in the world. The Dead Sea itself sits at roughly 430 meters below sea level, the lowest exposed surface on Earth. The surrounding terrain is rich in sulfur, bitumen, salt, and other minerals consistent with the geological activity of the Dead Sea Transform Fault. The Tel Mardik excavations in Syria, the ancient city of Ebla, produced tablets in the 1970s that some scholars initially read as containing references to the cities of the plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. That reading was disputed by Alfonso Archi and others, and the identification remains contested. But the Ebla tablets, dating to approximately 2400 BCE, confirm that Syrian scribes in the 3rd millennium BCE were recording the names of cities in the Jordan Valley region, establishing that the area was a known and documented part of the ancient Near Eastern urban network. Genesis 19 describes their destruction in terms that overlap with the Sumerian accounts in ways that have never been fully reconciled by mainstream scholarship. The Genesis text says, "The destruction came from the sky, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven." The Sumerian texts say the evil wind came from the direction of that same region. Genesis says the entire plain was overthrown, including the vegetation. The Sumerian laments say the fields went barren and the canals ran dry. Genesis says Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. The Dead Sea region is one of the most salt-saturated landscapes on Earth. The correspondence is not proof, but it is specific enough that dismissing it requires more than a wave of the hand. The overlap extends to the timing of the event within the annual cycle. The Lamentation texts specify that the evil wind arrived during a period when the fields were in cultivation, destroying crops along with people and animals. Genesis 19 places the destruction of Sodom in a period when Lot is sitting at the city gate, suggesting a normal day during the active season, not a winter night or a festival period. The lament for specifies that the storm came on a day when the city was going about its regular business, a detail that would be unremarkable if the text were purely theological, but becomes significant if it is recording the timing of a real event. Normal operations, suddenly interrupted. That is the signature of a catastrophe, not a siege. Sitchin's reading adds a layer that connects these two textual traditions through a physical mechanism. The weapons deployed at the cities of the plain produced a destruction event of sufficient magnitude to generate an atmospheric plume. That plume drifted northeast. The Sumerian cities, positioned directly in its path, recorded the arrival of this plume as the evil wind. The Hebrew tradition recorded the origin event. The Sumerian tradition recorded the downstream consequences. Two textual traditions from two cultures describing two ends of the same event. A modern atmospheric science provides an uncomfortable parallel. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded in 1986 in what was then the Soviet Union, the radioactive plume did not spread uniformly. It followed the prevailing winds. It moved northwest from Ukraine into Scandinavia, then shifted east across central Russia, then south into the Mediterranean. The pattern of contamination was directional, sequential, and mappable. Cities and regions, hundreds of kilometers from the reactor, recorded elevated radiation levels in the order determined by wind direction and speed. If the Sumerian scribes had been writing about Chernobyl, their account would read very much like the Lamentation, city by city, in order, from the direction the wind was blowing. The analogy is not proof. Chernobyl was a reactor failure, not a detonation. The scale, the chemistry, and the physics are different. But the atmospheric principle is identical. A catastrophic release of toxic material at a point source produces a plume that follows prevailing winds and deposits its effects sequentially on downwind populations. The question is whether the Lamentation describes a literary convention or an atmospheric event. If it describes an atmospheric event, The physics of plume dispersal predict exactly the pattern the text records. If you want to evaluate this yourself, the Lamentation text has been published in full. Michalowski's 1989 edition is the standard critical text. Kramer's earlier translations are available in multiple university libraries. The Genesis passages are in every Bible. The geographic data can be checked with any modern map. The prevailing wind patterns in the region are published in meteorological databases. Nothing about this claim is hidden behind proprietary data or restricted access. It is all available to anyone willing to do the reading. The Tall El Hammam excavation adds a forensic dimension that did not exist when Sitchin was writing. Stephen Collins and his team began excavating the site in the southern Jordan Valley in 2005. By 2021, they had published findings in Nature scientific reports documenting evidence of a catastrophic high-temperature event at the site. The destruction layer contained shocked quartz, minerals that form only under extreme pressure. It contained diamonoids, tiny diamond fragments produced by intense heat acting on carbon. It contained pottery that had been melted on one side but not the other, indicating a directional thermal pulse. The temperatures required to produce these effects exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. Collins and his team proposed a cosmic airburst as the cause, similar to the Tunguska event of 1908 in Siberia. The dating of the Tall El Hammam destruction, approximately 1650 BCE, does not match Sitchin's timeline, which places the event closer to 2000 BCE. This is a significant discrepancy and will be addressed in the counter case. But the physical evidence is independent of the dating question. Something destroyed a major Bronze Age city at the southern end of the Jordan Valley, with temperatures exceeding anything that ancient military technology or natural fire could produce. The destruction covered approximately 500 square kilometers of the surrounding Middle Gore region, and the area was abandoned for roughly 3 to 6 centuries afterward. The convergence is this. Sumerian tablets describe an evil wind that destroyed cities in a sequence consistent with an atmospheric event originating from the southwest. Hebrew texts describe a catastrophic destruction of cities in the exact region to the southwest of Mesopotamia, and modern archaeology has found physical evidence of a destruction event at a site in that same region, with characteristics that no conventional explanation fully accounts for. 3 independent evidentiary threads. Each one is contested. Each one has alternative explanations, but the question of whether all 3 point to the same event has not been seriously investigated by any mainstream academic institution. That silence is itself a data point. The Tall El Hammam findings deserve additional detail because they represent the kind of evidence that exists independently of any textual interpretation. The research team, led by Collins and including scientists from multiple institutions, documented a destruction matrix at the site that extended approximately 1.5 meters in depth. Within this matrix, they found spherules of melted material, platinum group elements at concentrations far exceeding background levels, and grain stored in pottery jars that had been carbonized on one side while remaining intact on the other. The directional nature of the destruction is critical. It was not a fire that consumed evenly. It was a thermal pulse arriving from a specific direction, consistent with an airburst event. The research team estimated the energy required to produce the observed effects as equivalent to roughly 1,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. The population of the Middle Gore region prior to the destruction has been estimated at roughly 40,000 to 65,000 people. After the event, the region was depopulated. Archaeological surveys show a gap in settled occupation lasting between 300 and 600 years. The soil chemistry in the destruction layer shows elevated salinity, which the research team interpreted as the result of the Dead Sea being partially vaporized or displaced by the blast, depositing salt-laden water across the surrounding agricultural land. The region that Genesis describes as being well-watered everywhere, like the Garden of the Lord, became a salt flat. It still is. The academic response to Sitchin's reading of the Lamentation texts has followed a pattern that repeats across nearly every case where an alternative researcher engages with primary Mesopotamian sources. The pattern has 3 stages. First, silence. Second, characterization. Third, continued silence. At no point does the pattern include engagement with the specific claims. When The Wars of Gods and Men was published in 1985, no Assyriological journal published a review. No peer-reviewed article appeared in the following decade addressing Sitchin's geographic sequencing argument. No scholar took a map, plotted the cities named in the Lamentation in the order the text presents them, and published a finding that the order does not correspond to a geographic trajectory. That work, the minimum required to refute the claim, has not been done. What has been done is characterization. Sitchin has been described as a pseudo-archaeologist, a fringe theorist, a popularizer without academic credentials in Sumerology. These descriptions are not inaccurate in the narrow sense that Sitchin did not hold a PhD in Assyriology, but they are not refutations. A characterization tells you what category someone belongs to. It does not tell you whether their specific reading of a specific text is wrong. Michael S. Heiser, who held a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, produced the most detailed published critique of Sitchin's translation methodology. Heiser's work is valuable precisely because it engages with specifics. He challenged Sitchin's readings of particular Sumerian terms, arguing that Sitchin assigned meanings to cuneiform signs that are not supported by the standard lexical literature. Heiser's critique is legitimate scholarship, and it lands on several of Sitchin's more ambitious linguistic claims. But Heiser's focus was philological. He addressed how Sitchin translated individual words. He did not address the geographic sequencing argument. He did not address the wind trajectory claim. He did not address the overlap between the Lamentation's description of the evil wind's effects and the symptoms one would expect from exposure to a high-energy atmospheric event. There is a distinction in academic method between two kinds of critique. The first addresses methodology. The second addresses conclusions. Heiser's work addresses methodology, specifically Sitchin's methods of reading cuneiform signs. This is important work, and where Heiser demonstrates that Sitchin has misread a sign or assigned a meaning unsupported by the lexical tradition, the correction stands on its merits. But methodology critique only invalidates the conclusions that depend on the challenged methodology. And the geographic sequencing argument does not depend on how any individual word is translated. It depends on the names of cities which are not disputed, and the order in which they appear, which is a feature of the text that any reader with Michalowski's edition can verify. The academic habit of treating all of a researcher's work as a single package, to be accepted or rejected in its entirety, is understandable but methodologically unsound. Sitchin's translation of a specific Sumerian logogram may be wrong without his observation about the geographic pattern in the Lamentation being wrong. These are independent claims. Refuting one does not refute the other. Yet the published critiques treat them as a single target. This is the gap. The strongest objections to Sitchin address his weakest claims. His readings of individual Sumerian logograms are often questionable by the standards of professional cuneiform studies. But the geographic pattern in the Lamentation text is not a translation issue. It is a structural observation about the order in which cities are named. You do not need to accept a single one of Sitchin's translations to check whether the cities appear in a geographically sequential order. You need a map and the text. The broader pattern in Assyriology is one of disciplinary boundary enforcement rather than substantive engagement. When Sitchin's books sold millions of copies in the 1980s and 1990s, the academic response was not to publish counter-readings that addressed his specific claims. The response was to classify him as outside the discipline and move on. This is understandable from a professional standpoint. Credentialed scholars have limited time and strong incentives to avoid engaging with work that might, by association, taint their own reputations. But the cost of this strategy is that the specific claims go unaddressed, and unaddressed claims, in the public imagination, begin to look like unanswered claims. Compare the treatment of Sitchin's claims with the treatment of other interdisciplinary proposals in ancient studies. When Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, proposed in 1991 that the erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx of Giza were consistent with water weathering rather than wind and sand, the Egyptological establishment responded with hostility. But they also responded with arguments. Mark Lehner, Zahi Hawass, and others published specific counter-readings that addressed the geological evidence directly. They did not simply label shock and move on. The Sphinx water erosion debate, whatever one thinks of its resolution, was a genuine debate. Both sides engaged with the evidence. The evil wind geographic sequencing argument has not received comparable engagement. No one has published the map. No one has demonstrated that the sequence is not geographic. The claim sits in the space between dismissed and refuted, and that space, in the age of the Internet, is where alternative research communities grow. The Tall El Hammam findings received a different but structurally similar treatment. Collins and his team published in a reputable journal. The peer review was rigorous. The evidence was physical, not textual. And yet the archaeological establishment responded with caution that, to an outside observer, looks indistinguishable from avoidance. Some researchers questioned the dating methodology. Others questioned whether the airburst interpretation was the best fit for the evidence. These are legitimate scientific objections. But they were raised without alternative explanations for the shocked quartz, the diamonoids, the directional melting of pottery, or the 3 to 6 century abandonment of a previously thriving agricultural region. The pattern repeats. The specific evidence is not engaged with on its own terms. Instead, the broader framework is characterized as implausible, and the specific evidence is left to wither by association. The media layer amplifies this dynamic. Documentaries about the fall of Sumer discuss the Elamite invasions, the Amorite incursions, the administrative strain of the Ur-3 bureaucracy. They do not discuss the evil wind as anything other than poetic imagery. Television programs about Sodom discuss the moral narrative of Genesis 19, the archaeological search for the cities of the plain, and the geological features of the Dead Sea region. They do not connect the Sodom destruction to the Sumerian lament literature. The two textual traditions are kept in separate boxes: Sodom in the biblical archaeology box, the Sumerian collapse in the ancient Near Eastern history box, and the atmospheric connection between them is never examined on camera. This is not conspiracy. It is disciplinary siloing. Biblical archaeology and Assyriology are separate departments with separate conferences, separate journals, and separate career tracks. A scholar who published a paper connecting the two traditions in the way Sitchin proposed would be stepping outside their disciplinary lane, and the professional consequences of that are well understood. Consider what a genuine refutation would look like. A scholar would take the Lamentation text, identify the cities in the order they are named, plot them geographically, and demonstrate that the sequence does not correspond to any physical trajectory. Or a scholar would identify a compelling literary reason for the specific order that accounts for its geographic appearance. Or a meteorologist would model the atmospheric conditions and demonstrate that a southwest to northeast wind pattern from the Dead Sea to southern Mesopotamia is physically impossible or vanishingly unlikely given the region's prevailing conditions. Any one of these publications would constitute substantive engagement. None of them exists. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a label. And for 4 decades, what the Lamentations geographic sequence has received is a label. The text itself remains where it has always been, in Philadelphia, in London, in Baghdad, available to any researcher who wants to check. To understand why the Lamentation text carries the weight it does, you have to understand what Sumer was before it ended. And to understand what Sumer was, you have to stand in the landscape where it was built. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq is flat. Not gently rolling, not undulating, flat. In many places, the horizon line is unbroken for 30 or 40 kilometers in every direction. The soil is river silt, deposited over millennia by seasonal flooding, and when irrigated it is among the most productive agricultural land on Earth. This is why civilization began here, not because the land was easy, but because it rewarded organized labor at a scale no other landscape could match. Build an irrigation canal and the yield multiplies. Build a network of canals and you can feed a city. Build a system for managing the network, and you have invented bureaucracy, taxation, and the written word, because someone has to keep track of who dug which canal and who owes grain to whom. The date palm orchards that once lined these canals produced a surplus so large that Sumerian scribes developed an entire accounting vocabulary just to track the harvest. Barley, emmer wheat, sesame, and onions grew in rotation, managed by temple administrators who recorded yields on clay tablets that survive today in museum collections from Philadelphia to Berlin. The system was fragile in exactly one way. It depended on the air being breathable and the water being clean. Interrupt either of those inputs, and the entire network collapses within a single growing season. There is no fallback crop. There is no alternative water source. The rivers are the system. The canals are the system, the flat, open, unshielded landscape that made irrigation so efficient also made the civilization uniquely vulnerable to any atmospheric contaminant that entered the plain from outside. The Sumerians did all of this by the middle of the 4th millennium BCE. Uruk, the first city in human history to reach a population of approximately 40,000, was already a functioning urban center by approximately 3,500 BCE. Eridu, which Sumerian tradition consistently names as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, sits at the southern edge of the plain near the marshlands where the rivers meet the sea. The distance between Eridu and is roughly 20 kilometers. The distance between and Nippur is roughly 160 kilometers to the northwest. The distance between Nippur and Babylon is roughly 80 kilometers further north. These cities were not scattered randomly. They were strung along the watercourses like beads on a thread, each one dependent on the same irrigation infrastructure, the same seasonal flooding, the same flat, open, unprotected landscape. A traveller walking from Eridu to Nippur in the late 3rd millennium BCE would have passed through nearly continuous settled territory. Farms abutted farms, canal junctions served as market points. Temple complexes rose from the plain like limestone islands, visible for kilometers. The population density of the southern Mesopotamian corridor at the height of the 3rd dynasty of has been estimated by some researchers at levels comparable to early medieval Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people, concentrated in a band no wider than 50 kilometers on either side of the rivers, producing agricultural surpluses that supported specialized craftspeople, priests, soldiers, scribes, and administrators. This was not a frontier. It was the most developed, most organized, most densely populated landscape on Earth in its era. And it had no natural defenses against something arriving on the wind. This is what makes the evil wind so devastating in the text. There are no mountains between the Dead Sea Basin and the southern Mesopotamian plain. The Jordan Rift Valley opens into the Arabian Desert, which slopes gently down toward the Tigris-Euphrates lowlands. An atmospheric event originating at the southern Dead Sea, at an elevation of roughly 400 meters below sea level, the lowest point on the surface of the Earth, would produce a plume that rises and then disperses according to prevailing wind patterns. The predominant winds in the region move from the west-southwest to the east-northeast, particularly during the spring and early summer months. A plume following these winds would cross the northern Arabian Desert and enter the Mesopotamian plain from the south-southwest, reaching the southernmost Sumerian cities first, then moving north-northwest along the river corridor. The Lamentation text describes exactly this pattern. Eridu falls first. Falls next. The destruction moves up the plain. The lament for the shorter and more emotionally concentrated companion text, provides granular detail about what happened when the wind arrived at a single city. The goddess Ningal, patron of pleads with the divine assembly to spare her city. She is refused. The wind arrives. The text describes the people of lying in heaps in the streets, not slain by weapons, not crushed by walls, but felled where they stood. The cattle in their pens are dead. The sheep in their folds are dead. The old men and women who could not flee are dead in their homes. The canals run with something other than water. Jacobson translated the relevant passage as describing a storm that overwhelms the land, a storm that no one can escape and no wall can block. The word storm, in this context, has been debated by scholars because the Sumerian term does not map neatly onto any natural meteorological phenomenon. It is not the word for a dust storm. It is not the word for a thunderstorm. It is a term that appears almost exclusively in the lament literature, suggesting that the scribes needed a specialized word for something they had not encountered before and would not encounter again. And the effects are not those of a military invasion. In a military invasion, walls are breached, defenders are killed, property is seized. The laments describe something else: people dying in the streets from an invisible agent, livestock collapsing in the fields, water becoming poison. These are not the effects of swords and siege engines. They are the effects of atmospheric contamination. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent more time with these texts than perhaps any scholar of the 20th century, noted the unusual specificity of the evil wind descriptions without drawing the connection Sitchin later drew. In The Sumerians, published in 1963, Kramer catalogued the imagery of the lament literature and observed that the wind motif appeared consistently across multiple compositions, always with the same characteristics. It was not a storm, it carried no rain, it was not cold. It killed by contact and it moved in a specific direction. Kramer treated this as a literary convention, but he documented it with the precision of a scholar who recognized that something in the texts did not quite fit the standard interpretive framework. Nippur provides a specific archaeological case. The site, excavated by the University of Pennsylvania beginning in the 1880s, shows a clear destruction and abandonment layer at the end of the third dynasty of Ur. The city, that had functioned as the religious capital of Sumer, the seat of Enlil, the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon, was abandoned for a period after the collapse. Excavators found evidence of rapid depopulation consistent with the lament literature's descriptions. The temple of Enlil, the Ekur, which the Lamentation text describes as being struck by the wind and abandoned by its god, shows physical evidence of a break in occupation. The stratigraphic record does not by itself prove what caused the abandonment, but it confirms that something ended Nippur's role as a functioning urban center at approximately the time the lament literature describes. And Nippur is not the southernmost city, it is deep in the interior of the plain. Whatever reached Nippur had already passed through every city between it and the southern edge of Sumer. Lagash and its administrative center Girsu, located southeast of Nippur and closer to the southern edge of the plain, show a parallel pattern. French archaeations at Tello, the modern name for the Girsu site, beginning in the 1870s under Ernest de Sarzec, revealed a city that had been one of the most powerful in Sumer during the late 3rd millennium BCE. The Gudea cylinders, among the most celebrated Sumerian literary compositions, were produced at Lagash during the period between the Akkadian Empire and the 3rd dynasty of Ur. By the time of the Ur III collapse, Lagash Girsu was a major administrative node, and like Nippur, like Ur, like every other city on the southern plain, its records terminate in the same narrow window. The Lamentation names Lagash. The archaeology confirms its end. The Era epic, a separate Akkadian composition preserved on tablets in the British Museum, provides what Sitchin read as the backstory. The poem describes Era, a god associated with pestilence and destruction, being granted authority by the supreme god Marduk to discipline cities that have become disobedient or corrupt. Era's lieutenant, Isham, attempts to restrain him, but Era proceeds. The text describes the deployment of weapons against specific targets, and the aftermath is described in terms that overlap with the Lamentation's evil wind. The Era epic has been dated to approximately the 8th century BCE as a literary composition, but scholars including Luigi Cagni, who published the critical edition in 1977, have noted that the poem likely draws on much older source material. The Divine Assembly, the council of gods that appears across Sumerian and Akkadian literature, is a recurring structural element in these destruction narratives. In the Atrahasis epic, the assembly decides to send the flood. In the Era epic, the assembly debates whether to permit Era's campaign of destruction. In the Lamentation, the assembly decrees the end of the current age. The consistency of this literary device has led mainstream scholars to read it as a theological convention. But Sitchin read it differently. He argued that the assembly was a governing body, that its debates reflected real disagreements among real beings about real policy decisions. and that the destruction of the cities of the plain was the outcome of one such decision. The beings the Sumerians called gods, in Sitchin's framework, were the Anunnaki, and their assembly operated as a deliberative body with competing factions, territorial claims, and strategic interests. Sitchin's reading connected the Era epic to the Lamentation through a causal chain. Era and Ninurta, acting on a decision by the divine assembly, deployed weapons against the Sinai Peninsula and the cities of the plain. The weapons are described in the Era text with terminology that Sitchin translated as referencing explosive force and radiant destruction. The evil wind was the atmospheric consequence. The Sumerian cities were not the targets. They were the downwind casualties. This reading has been characterized as eisegesis, the projection of modern concepts onto ancient texts. And that characterization is not without merit in the case of some of Sitchin's more specific translation choices. But the structural argument does not depend on any single translation. It depends on the geographic order of the cities, the direction of the wind, and the nature of the symptoms. These are observable features of the text that exist independently of how one translates any individual word. The region around the Dead Sea itself provides a final environmental detail. The southern basin of the Dead Sea, the area where the cities of the plain are traditionally located, is geologically active. The Dead Sea Rift is a transform fault boundary between the African and Arabian tectonic plates. The area is rich in sulfur, bitumen, and salt. Genesis 14 refers to the valley of Siddim as being full of slime pits, which is conventionally understood as bitumen seeps. The entire landscape is one of geological volatility. When the Genesis text says that brimstone and fire rained from the sky, it describes an event in a region where the raw materials for such an event are embedded in the ground. This does not prove that a nuclear or cosmic detonation occurred, but it establishes that the geographic setting is one where a catastrophic energy release would interact with local geology in precisely the ways the ancient texts describe. The southern Dead Sea has yielded other sites that contribute to this picture. Bab ed-Dra, located along the eastern shore of the Dead Sea in modern Jordan, was excavated by Walter Rast and R. Thomas Schaub beginning in the 1965 season and continuing through multiple campaigns. The site, which dates to the early Bronze Age, shows evidence of a violent destruction by fire around 2300 BCE. A nearby site, Numera, shows similar destruction evidence from a comparable period. Both sites have been proposed as candidates for the cities of the plain, though the identifications remain disputed. What is not disputed is that the southeastern Dead Sea region experienced catastrophic destruction events during the late 3rd millennium BCE, events severe enough to end urban habitation at multiple sites within a relatively narrow window. Whether those events were military, geological, cosmic, or something else is the question that remains open. The physical evidence of destruction is not in question, only its cause. The Weld Blundell Prism, the Sumerian king list, held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, provides the larger chronological frame. The king list records that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. It then passed to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. These are the 5 antediluvian cities. After the flood, kingship descended again, this time to Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, and onward through the dynasties of early Mesopotamia. The cities named in the Lamentation's destruction sequence overlap significantly with the cities named in the king list sequence of divine favor. The same cities that received kingship from heaven are the cities that lost everything to the evil wind. This is a point worth pausing on. The king list does not merely record a political history. It records a pattern. Kingship descends, civilization flourishes, something destroys it. Kingship descends again. The flood is the first great destruction. The evil wind, in the Lamentations framework, is the second. Both are presented as decisions made at a level above human agency, and both produce the same structural outcome. A civilization that had been established and maintained by divine authority is terminated by that same authority. The Sumerian scribes who composed the Lamentation were writing within a tradition that understood these cities as divinely established, divinely maintained, and divinely ended. The final years of the third dynasty of Ur are documented in a series of letters attributed to Ibbi-Sin, the last king, and his officials. These letters, preserved on clay tablets and translated by scholars including Piotr Michałowski and Thorkild Jacobsen, paint a picture of escalating crisis. Provincial governors stop responding to orders, grain shipments fail to arrive. The price of barley, the basic unit of the Sumerian economy, spikes to levels that indicate catastrophic supply disruption. Ibbi-Sin writes to his generals asking for troops. The generals write back saying the roads are impassable. The letters do not explain why the roads are impassable. The conventional explanation is Amorite raiding parties blocking the trade routes. But the lament literature describes a landscape in which travel itself has become lethal, not because of bandits but because of the condition of the air and water. The archaeological evidence from Ur itself is consistent with rapid abandonment rather than gradual decline. Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated Ur for the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum during the 1920s and 1930s, found destruction layers at the site dating to the end of the Third Dynasty. The residential quarters showed evidence of buildings left with their contents intact, doors standing open, as if the inhabitants had left in a hurry and never returned. This is not the pattern of a city conquered by a foreign army. Armies loot, armies occupy, armies repurpose. What Woolley found was a city that had simply been left behind. The gap between the end of the Third Dynasty of Ur and the re-establishment of urban life in southern Mesopotamia is measurable. It took generations. When cities like Ur and Nippur were eventually resettled, the new inhabitants built on top of the old ruins, and the intervening layers show sparse or no occupation. Something had made the land uninhabitable for a period of time, and whatever it was severe enough to keep people away from some of the most agriculturally productive territory in the known world. That framework of divine agency in Sitchin's reading was not metaphor. It was reportage in the only language the scribes had available. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem in any language. It runs to approximately 100,000 verses in its fullest recension, roughly 10 times the combined length of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was composed in Sanskrit, with its core narrative traditionally dated to the late centuries BCE, though the events it describes are placed by Hindu tradition in a much earlier period, sometimes as far back as the 4th millennium BCE. The text is housed in manuscript form across dozens of institutions, with the critical edition produced by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune, India, over a period of nearly 50 years, from 1919 to 1966. The Mahabharata describes a great war, and within that war it describes weapons. The Brahmastra, attributed to the god Brahma, is described as a weapon of last resort that, once invoked, cannot be recalled. Its deployment renders the targeted area barren. It destroys everything within its radius. The texts describe blinding light, a column of smoke that rises to the sky, and heat so intense that it chars the bodies of those caught in its path. In the Dronaparva, one of the 18 books of the Mahabharata, the deployment of the Brahmastra against an army is described in terms that include the falling out of hair and nails, the cracking of pottery, and the discoloration of foodstuffs. Birds fell from the sky. The text says the very elements seem disturbed. Survivors are described as wandering in confusion, their skin blistered, their senses impaired. The rivers near the deployment site are said to have boiled. The Pashupatastra, attributed to the god Shiva, is described as even more devastating, a weapon that once released cannot be countered by any other weapon, and that destroys not just the physical target, but the surrounding environment for an unspecified duration. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, a section of the Mahabharata, after witnessing the first nuclear test at Trinity in 1945. The line he chose was from the 11th chapter, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." What is less commonly discussed is that Oppenheimer was not drawing a casual literary parallel. He was a scholar of Sanskrit. He had read the texts in the original language, and the descriptions of divine weaponry in the Mahabharata had struck him as uncomfortably specific long before he ever worked on an atomic bomb. The connection between these textual descriptions and physical evidence in the Indian subcontinent has been a subject of alternative research for decades. The Indus Valley city of Mohenjo-Daro, located in what is now Sindh province, Pakistan, and excavated beginning in the 1920s, presents its own archaeological enigma. The city, which thrived from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE, was found to contain skeletons lying in the streets in positions suggesting sudden death rather than ritual burial or battlefield casualties. Some researchers have reported finding vitrified brick and fused material in certain layers, though these claims are contested, and the mainstream interpretation attributes the city's decline to shifting river courses and climatic change. The point is not that Mohenjo-Daro proves nuclear warfare in antiquity. The point is that the physical evidence at the site has never been fully reconciled with the conventional decline narrative, and the Mahabharata's descriptions of divine weapons and their effects have been in print for centuries, available to anyone willing to compare texts with stratigraphy. The parallel to the Sumerian accounts is structural, not merely thematic. The Mahabharata describes divine weapons deployed in a conflict among beings with superhuman capabilities. The weapons produce effects that include atmospheric contamination, soil sterilization, radiation-like symptoms in survivors, and long-term uninhabitability of the targeted region. The Sumerian Lamentation describes the aftermath of a similar event. The evil wind produces the same category of effects. People die from exposure to an invisible agent. Agricultural land becomes barren. Water becomes undrinkable. The affected region is abandoned for an extended period. Two literary traditions, separated by thousands of kilometers and composed in entirely different language families, describe the same category of event with the same category of effects. The conventional explanation is coincidence or diffusion, the idea that story motifs traveled along trade routes and were adapted by different cultures. Diffusion is a real phenomenon and accounts for many cross-cultural parallels. But diffusion typically produces thematic echoes, not specific symptom lists. When two texts independently describe hair falling out, water becoming poison, and land going barren after exposure to a weapon deployed from the sky, the level of specificity exceeds what casual cultural transmission would produce. The Book of Enoch adds a third thread. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon preserves a text that describes the Watchers, a group of divine beings who descended to earth, interacted with humans, and were eventually judged by the Most High. The judgment involved fire. The location of the judgment, in several readings of the Enochic geography, corresponds to the region of the Dead Sea. The Book of the Watchers, the oldest section of 1st Enoch, has been dated by most scholars to the 3rd century BCE, based on Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. But the tradition it draws on is older, and its geographic references to the place of punishment overlap with the Genesis account of Sodom's destruction. The Qumran caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found sit less than 50 kilometers from the traditional location of Sodom. The Aramaic fragments of 1st Enoch recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran date to approximately the 2nd century BCE, making them among the oldest known copies. The text they preserve describes a place of judgment where fire falls from the sky and the land is rendered permanently desolate. The geographic specificity of the Enochic account has been noted by scholars including George Nicolsburg, who published the critical commentary on 1st Enoch for the Hermeneia series. Nicolsburg observed that the Enochic geography maps with unusual precision onto the actual landscape of the Dead Sea region, including its sulfurous deposits, its desolate terrain, and its association with divine punishment. The scribes who composed the Book of the Watchers knew what the Dead Sea region looked like, and they associated that landscape with an ancient act of divine destruction. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiché Maya, describes successive worlds destroyed by the gods when the created beings failed to fulfill their purpose. The destruction mechanisms include flood, fire, and a rain of resinous substance from the sky. The structural parallel is not to the specific event at Sodom, but to the broader framework in which divine beings destroy civilizations that have outlived their utility. The Sumerian king list structure, in which kingship is granted and then withdrawn, operates on the same logic. Cities rise by divine favor, cities fall by divine decision. The wind, the fire, the flood, these are instruments, not causes. The Hopi creation traditions of the American Southwest add yet another thread. The Hopi describe a series of worlds, each one destroyed when humanity failed to live according to the Creator's plan. The third world was destroyed by fire, the survivors were led underground, and eventually emerged into the current fourth world. The Hopi elders have maintained for generations that the fire that ended the third world was not a natural event, but a weapon used by beings who had the power to reshape the Earth's surface. The geographic and cultural distance between the Hopi mesas of northeastern Arizona and the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia is vast. The linguistic and genetic distance is even greater, and yet the structural narrative, divine beings establishing civilizations and then destroying them with fire when those civilizations fail, or when the beings themselves disagree, repeats with a consistency that mere coincidence strains to explain. What Sitchin proposed was not that all of these traditions tell the same story. He proposed that they all preserve fragments of the same historical substrate. A period in which beings with advanced capabilities established settlements, managed human populations, came into conflict with each other, and resolved that conflict through the deployment of weapons whose effects are consistently described across cultures that had no plausible means of coordinating their accounts. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and is the most specific of these accounts, because it is the most bureaucratic. The Sumerian scribes were record keepers. They did not compose in epic verse. They composed in administrative prose, adapted to literary form. And when they recorded the destruction of their cities, they did it the way they recorded everything else. Methodically, sequentially, city by city, god by god, temple by temple. The evil wind entered from the south. It moved north. It killed everything in its path. And the first city it reached, the text tells us, was the one closest to its source. The strongest objection to this entire framework is chronological, and it deserves to be stated in full. Sitchin's timeline places the destruction of Sodom and the cities of the plain at approximately 2024 BCE, synchronized with the fall of the third dynasty of The Tall El-Hammam destruction layer, the physical evidence that most closely matches the profile of a catastrophic energy release in the Dead Sea region, has been dated to approximately 1650 BCE. That is a gap of roughly 374 years. It is not a minor discrepancy. If the Tall El-Hammam event is the physical correlate of the Sodom destruction, then Sitchin's dating is wrong. If Sitchin's dating is correct, then Tall El-Hammam is a different event entirely, and the physical evidence for the Sodom destruction remains undiscovered. Either way, the neat synchronization between the Sumerian collapse and the biblical destruction narrative fractures under scrutiny. There is also the question of whether Tall El-Hammam is even the right site. Collins identifies it with biblical Sodom based on its location, size, and the dating of its destruction layer. But other archaeologists, including those who favor the southern Dead Sea location for the cities of the plain, have challenged this identification. If Tall El-Hammam is not Sodom, then its destruction, however dramatic, is evidence of a different event entirely, and the connection to the Sumerian lament literature dissolves. There is a further objection. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and is a literary composition, not a field report. It was written after the events it describes, possibly decades or even a century later, and it was written within a genre that had specific theological conventions. The city lament genre required the poet to describe divine abandonment in formal terms. The sequence of cities could reflect liturgical order, the order in which the lament was performed in successive temples, rather than a geographic trajectory. Michalowski has noted that the text structure serves a ritual function, and that reading it as a literal record of events imposes a modern empiricism on a genre that operated by different rules. Heiser's philological objections also stand as genuine obstacles. If Sitchin's translations of key terms in the era epic are incorrect, then the connection between the era narrative and the deployment of weapons of mass destruction weakens considerably. Heiser argued that the terminology Sitchin rendered as nuclear or explosive force can be read more naturally as conventional descriptions of divine power, consistent with other Mesopotamian literary references to gods acting through storms, disease, and natural disaster. These are not trivial objections. They challenge the interpretive foundation on which the entire framework rests. And yet, the geographic sequence has not been addressed. The overlapping symptom descriptions have not been addressed. The question of why a literary poet would organize a theological lament by wind trajectory rather than by theological importance has not been addressed. The physical evidence at Tall El Hammam, whatever its precise dating, documents a destruction event in the Dead Sea region whose characteristics match no conventional explanation. The dating discrepancy is real, but a dating discrepancy is a problem of calibration, not a refutation of the underlying observation. The question is whether a catastrophic event occurred in the region the Hebrew Bible associates with Sodom, producing atmospheric effects that reached Mesopotamia. The dating tells you when. It does not tell you whether. The debate remains genuinely unresolved, and the resolution, if it ever comes, will not come from characterization. It will come from someone plotting the cities on a map and publishing the result. If the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and preserves even a partial geographic record of a real atmospheric event, the consequences for conventional ancient Near Eastern chronology are substantial. The fall of the third dynasty of would require a new causal framework, one that accounts for environmental catastrophe rather than purely military and administrative failure. The relationship between the Sumerian and Hebrew textual traditions would need to be reassessed, not as distant cultural echoes, but as complementary records of a shared event, viewed from different geographic positions. The era epic would need to be re-examined not as theological fiction, but as a narrative encoding of a specific military decision by specific agents. And the entire framework by which mainstream Assyriology separates literary texts from historical records would face a challenge it has so far avoided. The question is not whether Sitchin was right about everything. He almost certainly was not. The question is whether the specific pattern he identified in the Lamentation, a geographic sequence of city destructions consistent with an atmospheric event originating southwest of Mesopotamia, is real. That question can be answered. It requires no exotic technology, no classified data, no access to restricted archives. It requires a cuneiformist, a geographer, and a meteorologist sitting in the same room with a copy of Michalowski's edition, a topographic map, and a wind pattern database. The study could be completed in a semester. It could be published in any peer-reviewed journal of ancient Near Eastern studies. It would either confirm or eliminate the geographic sequencing claim once and for all, and in 4 decades, no one has done it. The fact that the study has not been done is not proof that the pattern is real. Absence of refutation is not confirmation, but it is evidence of something. It is evidence that the academic system, as currently structured, has no mechanism for engaging with claims that originate outside the credentialed mainstream, even when those claims are specific, testable, and grounded in artifacts that the mainstream itself has catalogued and published. The artifacts are real, the texts are published, the map is available, the wind blows from the southwest, and the question has not been answered. If the Sumerian lament literature preserves atmospheric data alongside its theology, the implications extend beyond chronology. They extend to method. The assumption that ancient literary texts cannot contain physical data is not a finding. It is a premise. It was adopted by the founders of modern Assyriology in the 19th century, when the discipline needed to distinguish itself from biblical literalism and establish its scientific credentials. That premise has served the field well for over a century, but it was a methodological choice, not a law of nature. And the question of whether a given text contains physical data embedded in its literary structure can only be answered by checking, not by assuming. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and is in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It is in the British Museum. It is in the Iraq Museum. The tablets have been there for decades. Michalowski's critical edition has been in print since 1989. The Lament for translated by Jacobson, is available in The Harps That Once. The Genesis account is in every hotel nightstand in the Western world. The Era Epic tablets are catalogued in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, and the map of southern Mesopotamia has not changed in 5,000 years. The cities are where they have always been: Eridu in the south, to the northwest, Nippur further still. The wind came from the southwest. The text says so. The cities fell in that order. The text says that too. What the text does not say, what no text from that period could say, is what produced the wind. That question, the question behind the list, the question the Lamentations scribe could record but not answer, is still open. It has been open since Kramer first read the tablets in Philadelphia in the 1940s. It is still open now.